Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Critical Eye. We're going to dismantle or unveil the depth of the relationship between Russia and the axis of resistance. Some might call it the Islamic resistance axis. Others may think of it in terms of the emergence of a Eurasian powerhouse, which is causing shockwaves across the globe, but particularly in the corridors of power in Washington and Europe. So, what are the implications of this rising Eurasian powerhouse, particularly with a focus on Russia, which has proven that it's a decent ally, certainly to Syria, is proven its worth in terms of holding off a lot of the machinations of Zionist Western imperialism in that theater. Russia, of course, has its own issues and problems with Western Europe across the borders in Europe, of course. Navalny and the opposition that we've seen recently of Mr. Putin is just one example of how the West is still continually, arguably, creating problems for Russia wherever it possibly can. What does all this mean for the world? What does it mean for West Asia in particular? And where are the fault lines where Russia isn't necessarily that pally with the likes of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the likes of Syria, and perhaps Lebanon? So these fault lines, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Alexander Azadgan. I'm going to give a little bit more of a detailed rundown of his role, but welcome to the show, Brother Alexander. And I'm going to also welcome Maulana Syed Muhammad Razavi. Welcome, Aga.
Thank you for hosting.
Well, Maulana, I'm going to start with yourself. Firstly, what we've got is a situation where this week, where, if you like, many of us are celebrating the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini touched down in Iran after the Shah fled. A classic example in late 20th century of, if you like, imperialists losing out. Of course, the Soviet Union fell not too long afterwards, relatively speaking. Can you, first of all, just define from the resistance axis perspectives, the role of Russia in terms of West Asia? How do the likes of Syria and Iran actually view Russia beyond its obvious support?
Well, I mean, at the beginning of Islamic Revolution and before Islamic Revolution, one of the common slogans that were being shouted were anti-America, anti-Russia, anti-Israel, and United Kingdom. But with the development of war and war being imposed on Islamic Republic of Iran by the Western countries, the things changed, and there were many factors behind it. First of all, America had helped Shah to have a good army, but he did not educate them in running the equipment and everything. And basically, the army of Shah was totally dependent on America. And as soon as they left and war was imposed on Iran, it was necessary to have some kind of connections to others to survive. And Russia came forward and did assist and help Iran because they had some common interest in the region, especially Russia was concerned about Syria not losing Syria, and also Iran. It was for Iran. It was very important to have an Arab, because the West was trying to separate and divide Sunni Shia, create division between Sunni Shia Muslims and Arab and non-Arab Muslims. So it was very important for Iran also to maintain a good relationship with an Arab ally or country. And Syria was the country which was playing that role. And plus, there are many Alawis and Shia Muslims in Syria who have common interest, and we have holy shrines in that country. So, the common enemy of Russia in relation to Syria and the Middle East was Israel. So, Iran and Russia somehow cooperated together. And the good thing that Iran did was not to repeat the experience that Shah had, and they tried to become independent, and that's why now we see that although Russia is with Iran up to some extent, but at the same time they have maintained their independence and military and other resources, so they can survive on their own without foreign help.
Okay, again, I'm going to reintroduce Professor Alexander Azadgan to the proceedings. Alexander is a professor of strategic global management and international political economy. His expertise is actually in foreign policy, international relations, geopolitics, and international business, as well as cultural, religious, and sociological aspects and angles of things, especially those pertaining to the regions of North America, Eurasia, the Middle East, etc. Professor Azadgan, I understand, is a regularly published author and senior lecturer at numerous Iranian think tanks, in addition to being a senior geopolitical analyst on Press TV, Radio Sputnik, and Al Mayadeen, various others as well, several Russian news channels, interestingly enough. And he's also a keynote speaker in international conferences and symposiums internationally. Dr. Azadgan, thank you for sharing your time with us. We've got several questions, as you've heard. I've put it to Maulana, but your knowledge around Russia and its own, if you like, attitude and its geopolitical, if you like, strategy in West Asia would be a great point to start.
Yes, it's good to be with Ahlebait channel's viewers. I've heard fantastic things about this channel, and you have very select viewership that's very knowledgeable, both religiously in terms of theology and doctrine, as well as the materialistic areas like geopolitics. We have to distinguish between the Russian foreign policy in West Asia because they have different policies when it comes to Iran. The Russo-Iranian relations is one thing, the Russo-Syrian relationship is another, and the third one that comes to my mind is the Russo-Iraqi relationship, and then further down the line, the Russo-Egyptian relationship under Kemal Nasser. 4 different angles, 4 different strategies and tactics for Russia. I'll focus with the first one because we are in the Dahe Fajr, the last 10 days before the Iranians celebrate their Islamic Revolution. I'll focus on the Russo-Iranian relationship really quick, and I'm gonna just whet the appetite of your audience by focusing on the theological and eschatological, believe it or not, alliance that's taking place between Iran, the Shia Iran, and Russia. I'm part of a Russian think tank who is they are strongly promoting this narrative that in the end times that we're living in the last days that we're living in, the true church that will come to the aid of the school of thought of the progeny of Prophet Muhammad will be the Russian Orthodox Church. This narrative is being promoted. Some of the great ideologues and philosophers of this narrative have actually done the walk from Najaf to Karbala, not this time around because of COVID, but in the previous years. And one of the individuals, one of the sheikhs who is involved in this narrative, he's actually a Sunni sheikh, regularly invited to Iran for conferences. I met him in person in the 6th International Palestine Conference sponsored by the Iranian Parliament about 3 years ago. He's actually Sunni. He lives here in the Caribbean part of the Western Hemisphere, extremely well represented on YouTube, and then his specialty is Islamic eschatology. So there's this narrative that's taking place that the alliance between Iran and Russia is beyond just materialistically geopolitical interests focused around oil, and more important than oil, natural gas. Russia and United States are the first and the second top producers of natural gas, and this is directly related to what we're talking about. And then you have Qatar as the third largest producer, and then Iran. Part of the reason Qatar and Iran are getting closer together is because they have mutual interest in this huge, gigantic natural gas under the Persian Gulf. The Iranians call the Pars Field, and the Qataris call the North Field. The Iranians were always concerned because they felt Russia, whether under Tsarist Russia or under Soviet Union, and now predominantly Russia, that their aim is to have access to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. This has always been the strategic goal of Russia. And the U.S., believe it or not, on many instances played a positive role when it comes to making sure Iran doesn't become a vassal state to Russia. Now, all that ended in 1979. What happened a little bit before the Iranian Revolution? You had the Russians invading and occupying Afghanistan. Of course, on the western parts of Iran, you had Iraq, whose army is 100% at that time supplied by the Russians. Saddam Hussein was the big ally of the Soviet Union. They wanted to sandwich Iran, and the ultimate goal of Russia was to occupy Iran, just like they were occupying Afghanistan for all those years, which practically destroyed that country up to today. There was the incident during President Carter's tenure, toward the end of his tenure, where Washington actually wanted to attack Iran and liberate its so-called hostages. Their planes and their helicopters, we were told, somehow got into an accidental crash, and that plot was not allowed to be successful. Later on, evidence came out. It was quite possible that the Russians may have used very advanced technology from the space, believe it or not, to zap those planes, to make sure that what the Americans were planning would not happen, because they had their own interest in Iran. And the Russian role, because not much is published on this, the Russo-Iranian relationship, I would say in the past 20 years, scholars are actually going back into history and into the present situation and actively writing about it. Unfortunately, most of it is in Persian. We need to have them translated to English. The role that both the Soviet Union, really actually going back to the Tsarist, Russia, the very destructive role they played against Iran in taking major territories from Iran. The countries that are called Armenia right now, a country that's called Azerbaijan, even Georgia itself. Tsarist Russia took those territories from the Qajar dynasty of Iran, and those were some of the best agricultural lands of Iran. And your audience would be surprised to know that the Shah of Iran, the father of the Shah of Iran, Reza Shah, was actually an Iranian of Georgian descent, the Persian country of Georgia. So these territories were taken away because the Qajars were extremely incapable, the Qajar dynasty. In came the Pahlavi dynasty, and the Pahlavi dynasty, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, was a man who served in the Russian Cossack brigade. He didn't know how to read or write, but he served. He was a Kazakh, as we say in Persian. And then, so that sort of tendency to move away from Russia started with him, even though he was an officer in the Kazakh brigade. And how can we possibly forget the Great Persian Famine of 1917 to 1919, where around 9 million Iranians died due to famine and disease. You reverse that number and you come up to 6 million Jews. The greatest Holocaust in history was actually against the Iranians. The Russians were facilitating it in the north, and the British were facilitating it in the south, and the country practically became the sphere of influence of these two gigantic empires. That's the context behind this. Now, the entire thing is shifting. You know, in political science and international relations, we have a saying that no enmity nor an alliance will be forever. Who would have thought that Russia would be today's Iran's ally, a country that committed tremendous atrocities? I have family members going back several generations ago. The story was that when the Russians were coming, and most of my Iranian family members are in the north side of Iran, the story was that when the Russian army was coming down into Iran in various skirmishes, run for your lives, because the first thing they're going to do is rape all your women. We actually had a family member who was raped by Russian soldiers, and we are talking godless communist soldiers. In the Tsarist times, religion played a positive role, but during communist times, it was just anything went. And so it was that tremendously traumatic, physical and mental, on the Iranians. But because of all the horrible, mistakes and the faux pas in the American foreign policy, in our foreign policy in the region, somehow the Russians have come in and are being presented as the good guys, and in many times they are. The role they played in Syria to contain the massive societal chaos in Syria was constructive. They stood next to the Iranians and Hezbollah and the Syrian Arab Army, the legitimate army of Syria. These three, paid the most in terms of blood, but the Russians did cover the air. They did cover the air campaign. Now shifting to the Russo-Syrian relations, this has been a historical one.
Professor,
Yes.
Professor, I just like to hold you there. I will come on to the Syrian thing just to break it up and come to Maulana. Do hold your thought there, because I want to move westwards with you in terms of the Russian, engagement with that part of the world. But Maulana, Alexander brought up some fascinating history. Of course, Ayatollah Khomeini, who landed this time, back in 1979 to lead this Islamic revolution, if you like, in Iran, would have known about all this history, and certainly the history of Mossadegh and the Western imperialist, if you like, equally nasty, if you like, attitude towards Iran is there for everybody to see. We know that the CIA was involved in trying to overthrowing Mossadegh, and in a very, 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 very vicious kind of way, and to bringing the Shah back into power. But I want to focus if a little bit on Iran, if there are any thoughts you have on what the professor said, but also, when Ayatollah Khomeini landed, he said, "No East, no West." This was a very famous slogan from the early days of the revolution. He says, "No East, no West. Islam is the best." Essentially, that's we're going in a direction, and that's exactly what's happening. Iran has established a new kind of spiritual, moral politics. At least it's making an effort. We can argue all night, how successfully or not. That's a different story, but they're certainly standing up for something new, a different kind of politics, a divinely inspired kind of politics and system in Velayat Faqih, for instance. But I'm more interested in now the major protagonists in that region really are shaping up to be Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, Russia and Americans are all there in the party as well. But if there is likely to be a war, it's going to be between those two, or certainly with those two behind it. So let's talk about Russia and Israel. During all of this war in Syria, the Russians have regularly allowed sorties by the Israelis to come into Syria and to bombard as and how they like, and they've not really activated the S-300s or let alone S-400s. I don't think they've given the Syrians S-400s, but certainly S-300s. None of them have been used to fend off the Israeli airstrikes. It's almost like Russia is going to be quite comfortable with Israel continuing to be the system it is. So Iran and Russia's, if you like, interests don't ally absolutely. Do you see a point where that alliance might fall through very soon?
I don't think so. I mean, looking at what is happening in the world, Russia needs some kind of alliance in the Muslim world and Arabs. And also, America is trying to oppose Russia's influence both in West and East. So I don't think it would collapse. But as a Muslims, we believe that eventually Kalimatullahi al-Uliya, that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will survive and would be the word of God. I mean, whether it's Christian, Jew, or Muslims. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, that the Orthodox Christians would be the ones who may be willing to follow the advice of Jesus Christ and give hands in allegiance to Imam Mahdi Ajalullah Ta'ala Farajuhu, and the other Christians around the world may not follow the same footpath. If that is the case, then I would say yes, Russia relationship with Russia is better than some other countries.
Okay, coming back to you, Professor, I I do want you to go on to the Syria issue, and I've raised the same question around Israel. And one of the fault lines, which I think manifests, is that Russia wouldn't be totally committed to the axis of resistance. Certainly, Syria, Iraq, and Iran and Lebanon seem to be, or certainly Hezbollah seem to be moving that way. Yemen is involved in that axis of resistance quite clearly in terms of the Houthi, in terms of the Ansarullah, at least. So, your take on how far Russia is going to go in this alliance with the axis of resistance, and I'd also like you, as a caveat, to focus back on Russia's internal relationship with Muslim nations a little more, because we know Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all of these lands are hugely Islamic, if you like, and have had their liberation from the Soviet yoke after many, if you like, decades. And I'd like you to just give us a little inkling as to what we see there in Central Asia, particularly in terms of the relationship of Russia and the Muslim world. But first, let's turn to West Asia, Syria, and Israel, etc.
Yes, the Russo-Syrian relationship goes back a long time. Today, the only Russian military base outside of Russia, outside of Crimea, is in Tarsus and Latakia. So, and there, believe it or not, many intermarriages between Russian women and Syrian Muslim women, and these Russian women converted to Islam, either the Alawite school of thought or our Sunni brothers school of thought, and so there's deep cultural alliances between these two countries that goes back to decades, really, since Hafiz al-Assad's time. Russia is committed. Will never, wherever Russia goes, Russia will never retreat. This is the problem, of course, for countries who want to be independent, like Iran. You're right. The slogan of the Iranian Revolution in Persian, "Na Sharqi, na Gharbi, Jomhuriye Islami," which literally means, it's interesting they put East at the first. It said neither East, neither West. Islam is the best, as you said, or Islamic Republican system is what they were really saying. It doesn't exactly rhyme, but the intent was, we don't want. First of all, first and foremost, we have to resist the East. And that time, East really symbolized communist China and communist Russia, because from an Islamic perspective, from a Christian perspective, certainly from a Russian Orthodox perspective, Soviet Union was a sacrilegious system, an anti-God system, and in the Russian Orthodox narrative, that's why it fell, because they tried to edge God out of one of the most Christian countries in the world, that being Russia. So, as far as the Russian, the Russo-Israeli relationship that's also a very complicated one. Russia has its own national interest in the region, and they're certainly not going to be affected, unfortunately, by the axis of resistance. A couple of years ago, you had King Salman and his little dictator son visit Russia and sign some very lucrative weapon contracts, armament contracts with the Russians. This was unheard of. Saudi Arabia has always been an ally state, a vassal state of us here in the United States. A couple of days ago, I read that the Saudis are actually interested in the S-400 system. This is if they keep that going, they're gonna get the same fate that the last Shah of Iran got. The last Shah of Iran was, of course, a puppet of us, of Americans. And the minute he started to stretch his legs and talk about who the real enemy is, and he was talking about the people that control the New York Times and the global economy. He actually was talking the talk. But when you are a Freemason lapdog of the British and the Americans, the minute you start speaking truth to power, they kick you out. Same thing is going to happen with the Saudis if they decide to venture out and want to buy weapons from Russia. But it seems to me that Russia is courting everybody right now because there's a vacuum. Horrible misadventures, foreign policy misadventures, starting with George W. Bush in the Middle East. We are a wasted power in the Middle East, and so they're coming in. As far as the Russo-Israeli relationship that I was talking about, you have to understand that 10% of the Israeli population actually comprises of Russian and Ukrainian Jews. This is really, really interesting. They have a tremendous lobby within Israel, and they serve as a tremendous bridge between Israeli national interest and the Russian national interest. You have the entire RCB, Russian Central Bank, practically under the supervision of let's just use the J word here, Russian Jews. Okay, some of the most senior advisors to Putin are Russian Jews. Russian Jews have always been looked upon very suspiciously in Russia, especially under the Tsarist rule. In the Soviet Union, of course, they played a crucial role in communism itself. All the ideological fathers of communism happen to be European Jews, and in some instances Russian Jews. The Tsar and his family that were assassinated in the most barbaric way in the so-called House of I forgot what it's called in Russian. Have an interesting House of Special Purpose in Yekaterinburg in Russia. The person who was in charge of the murder was a Russian of Jewish ethnicity. We're talking major issues, but the way the Ukrainians look at their Jewish population is very antagonistic. Russia looks at Jewish population within Russia. So some of the worst atrocities that are committed against the Palestinians at the borders and what have you are committed by Israeli soldiers who happen to be of Russian or Ukrainian descent. Israelis, believe it or not, Sephardic Israelis, true Jews, if you may. I don't believe in Israel. The true Jews, the Sephardic Jews, because they're olive skinned, because they're more Middle Eastern, they seem to have more common with the Palestinians, from what I've been told by Israeli colleagues, believe it or not, than they do with these Russian and Ukrainian category of Jews, which are very harsh. They have the Soviet mentality, extremely strong-handed in the worst way possible. So that alliance is not going anywhere soon. They have Israel and Russia have tremendous economic relationship. President Putin unfortunately panders to them, but President Putin is not Russia. There are many other interests in Russia, and the school of thought that I was mentioning to you that is trying to create some kind of a bridge between I don't like to use the word Shia Islam anymore because they have so much connotation. I feel more comfortable with using the Arabic word Ahlebait, or the progeny of Prophet Muhammad. These people believe me, there's no love lost between these people, these group of Russians, who some of them are actually senior advisors to Putin. They have his other ear while the other ones have his left ear. There is no love lost between them and Israelis. Trust me. I get published under think tanks. They look at, from a historical perspective, these category of Russians look at Russia as the revived Roman Empire. The word Tsar comes from the Latin word Tsar or Caesar. So they actually, the motto of one of these think tanks that I write for, Russian think tanks called Geopolitica, in Latin, the motto of this think tank is Carthago delenta est, which means Carthage must burn. They identify ancient Carthage with America, and they identify themselves as the Holy Roman Empire, which really never went away when you think of it until World War I. So there is this total new identity that's emerging. Meanwhile, in Eurasia, you have these countries that are finding their Islamic identity away, an identity that was brutally and savagely suppressed by the Soviets. You have the situation in the Xinjiang province of China with the Muslim Chinese, the Uyghurs. Tremendous persecution, almost at the concentration camp level. And then you have these countries in between, Eurasian countries, obviously between China and Russia, that are trying to find their own voice. You have Tajikistan, a Persian-speaking country. They feel more Iranian, more Persian than the actual Iranians. They are going back to very ancient Iranian identity of them in the most Tajik way. And let's not forget, I'll finish it with this thought here, Mohsin, that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, for us, a clear and present danger to the United States. China will be our strategic adversary in the decades to come. The Belt and Road Initiative does not go through any of these countries that are part of this new economic arrangement that's coming out between Russia and several of these Eurasian countries. Iran is an observing nation. I mean, they have this whole mentality of recreating Soviet Union minus the communism, minus the total hegemony of Russia. And none of that actually goes through these countries that are part of this new economic unity, Eurasian economic unity that Russia is part of, Armenia is part of. I wrote a paper on the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and I actually talked a lot about the relationship of these Eurasian countries and how that BRI does not go through these territories. This is symbolically huge, which means there's a great rift between Russia and China that we don't hear much within the axis of resistance, because we think these two countries are part of the same axis and they're both fighting America. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Sino-American economy is completely intertwined. Anyone who thinks this arrangement is going to go away anytime soon is mistaken. It doesn't matter if the Chinese are dumping the US dollar. It doesn't really matter if they're buying tremendous amounts of gold. It does, however, matter, Mohsin, that the Chinese are no longer buying our treasury bills, which means they are no longer financing our debt. If our debt is not financed, our dollar will lose its value, and there goes the entire global economy. So these issues are extremely complicated. I just tried to paint an image of
you've been absolutely riveting. I wish I had another hour. We're certainly going to invite you back to another show, because we've only just scratched the surface of this analysis, and it's a really really fascinating one to hear. Maulana, Alexander's opened up so many avenues, but I'm going to let you conclude in the last minute or so with your thoughts, some reflections on what the professor has put forward, and what your hope is perhaps for the future of West Asia in the context of the Russian involvement.
Well, I mean, if we look at the West, certainly they are losing grip, and America is not successful in its policies, and the West is not successful in policies, and China and Russia are doing much better than any other country. And if they are successful in developing, especially they are building a seaport in Pakistan, I mean, the Gwadar, and connecting connecting China to the hot waters of Indian Ocean, and also I'm sure Russia would have a similar program via Iran to kind of get connected to these warm waters. So basically, it's in the interest of Iran, China, and Russia, and a non-aligned movement to be together in opposition to the Western so-called powers.
Maulana, thank you very much. I mean, the only final thought that occurs to me is that just yesterday, Iran announced a very prominent effort to actually formally make an alliance between what's known as the axis of resistance. That would make a huge statement, I think, of actually creating a bloc. And maybe that's what the Muslim world ultimately needs to do in order to resist, whether it's Russian, Chinese, or American, if you like, control of that region. The first things, I guess, is that the Muslims themselves have to wake up and create a powerful economic, military, and scientific bloc there in the center. The quicker they do that, the more benefit for all of the Muslim people of that world, and in fact probably better for the whole world altogether if there's a powerful Islamic bloc there in the center of the world effectively, because it will mean no more wars, no more instability, but a rock solid place which could actually become a benefit to all the world rather than being manipulated by imperialist interests in that region. Thank you ever so much to Professor Alexander. You're very welcome, your first show with us. And also thank you to Maulana for his erudite sort of reflections as well. Until the next edition of Critical Eye, Assalamu alaikum.